So I actually want to start with you, Jonathan. I mean, your parents' story is just extraordinary. Can you talk a little bit about how it went from, a story to being a script and then being in the hands of Andy Serkis?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. As a film producer, you spend a lot of your life looking for stories. So it dawned on me, perhaps slightly slowly, that I was sitting on a story that I knew an awful lot about. But I was very trepidatious about trying to bring it to the screen because there would be nothing worse than making a family biopic that you didn't like yourself. So I went about it very slowly, and the first ingredient was the writer. I saw a play called Shadowlands some years ago, written by Bill Nicholson, which I adored and cried all the way through. And it had the right tone, I felt, for the story that I wanted to tell. I then worked with Bill on a film, Elizabeth Golden Age, and afterwards I asked him if he would write this story, and he said that he would, but on one condition. And that condition, which is a lovely thing for a producer to hear, is he said, don't pay me until and unless the film happens. So I thought, okay, that's very good. His logic being, this is your story, so it mustn't fall into the hands of anybody else. It mustn't be controlled by anybody else. So we worked on the script for many years, in between Bill's other jobs and assignations. And then the critical ingredient was bringing on Andy Serkis as the director, who introduced all sorts of other elements to the script beyond what Bill and I had developed. But the critical thing, which came together last year, was finding the two people who Andy and I felt would best and most beautifully portray my parents, and here they are. And the moment that we met them both, we knew that we had to make the film.
And Andy, from your perspective, obviously you've done Second Unit, and obviously you've been working on Jungle Book, but as your kind of directorial debut, what was it about this project and this script?
Well, Jonathan and I had set up this company, The Imaginarium, which was really all about next generation storytelling using performance capture. It was a performance capture studio with a production entity joined together, and so we were looking at material, building a slate across film, TV, video games, virtual reality, augmented reality, and stage, for all sorts of expression of great stories. How we would tell stories in the next 10, 20 years' time, and the technology that would allow us to do that. And we both brought ideas to our increasing slate, and of course one of the projects that had been living with Jonathan for a few years beforehand was the project that he'd been working on with Bill. And we one night I read the script, and it was as we'd started to work on lots of our other projects that we were developing, and I read it, and it was the most powerful, moving, extraordinary story, and brilliantly rendered by Bill, and brought me to, emotionally to pieces, actually. And that has never, I don't think, happened to me before, or hadn't happened to me before, to that level, by purely reading a script. So I went the next day, and I said, Jonathan, can we meet for lunch? And all these things happen at lunchtime, don't they? And we we sat down and had lunch, and I came into the restaurant and quite trepidatiously said, I'd really like to direct your parents' story. And it didn't seem that, it was sort of slightly outside of my wheelhouse traditionally. We were working on lots of other extraordinary things, and this was an extraordinary story, but in a more conventional form. And Jonathan said yes, that he thought it was a good idea. And I explained what I loved about it, and apart from the fact that it was a most incredible script and an extraordinary love story and a true love story about true love, was that these people were mavericks. They were outsiders. They were pioneers. They were people who were breaking the mold and shattering the idea of what it is to be disabled back in those times, and through personal tenacity and great wit and great buoyancy and great humour, were able to move people and transform other people's lives. So that was how it kind of came together.
And Claire and Andrew, did you have similarly strong reactions to these characters on the page?
Yeah, I mean, it's so moving. The Bill script is so moving, and it's very rare you read a film script that just kills you and just makes you a blithering mess of a person in a puddle of your own tears and snot. And that's what happened to all of us. And then we tried to just do that justice and do the lives of Jonathan's parents justice. It's and it's really for me it felt like a template of how to live, how what Robin and Diana did. Somehow they made such a joyous, inspired, fully lived, rich life experience out of terrible loss, and we all go through loss. That's why I think it's such a universal story and such a inspiring story for every person, no matter where they come from or what their specific imprisonment or loss is. It feels universal in that way, and I think so. For me, I just read it. I was like, I want to live like that. I want to live like how they lived, and maybe by doing it, some of Robin and Diana and Jonathan will rub off, and it didn't. But I tried.
I'd never read a script where I didn't think about it. I was sort of judging it as if how was it going to be made and how was I going to do it or anything like that. I quite like this one. I just read it and and by the end couldn't actually see because I was crying so much. And I couldn't read the end of it then for the rest of the shooting. I never read it ever again. But I'd never read anything that had affected me quite like that. And then to have two people making it who it was their life, and the other who's just such a kind-hearted, generous, wonderful person, I was like, I'd be mad not to do it. So I'm very pleased that I did.
Okay, we'll take questions now. If you can pop your hand up if you have one, and obviously remember to say who you are and where you're from. That would be lovely. Gentleman here. This gentleman at the front.
Good morning. I've got a couple of questions, if I might, to Andrew. I really loved your performance in this film, by the way. I thought it was really great. And you've you've done very physical performances in the past, likes of Spider-Man. And in this performance, for a lot of the runtime, you're restricted to just your face, your head, in portraying those emotions. How did this affect the way you rehearsed and the way you performed the role?
It was just a technical challenge to make it second nature. I think the inability to follow physical impulses and also the rhythm of the breathing machine. That was probably the trickiest technical challenge because, as we know, like right now, my breathing as I'm speaking to you is rather nervous and it's kind of jagged and out of rhythm, and I get to have thoughts interrupt and it affects my breath. But when that's happening for Robin and other people who live on ventilators, there's just this one stream of breath. So it's very, very hard to express panic or joy or any different kind of emotion. So all of that, I found, went into my face. And I think that's what happened with Jonathan's dad, is that his eyes became all that more alive. There was the soul, all of his longings, all of his emotion and feeling came. His eyes and his face were his main form of expression. They were still that was the purest transmission of who he was. And then he had to master the breathing machine. He had to master how to use the breathing machine like an instrument. And he used to get very, very frustrated because people would finish his sentences. So he had to figure out a way of finishing, like going halfway through a thought and finishing on a word that no one would have any idea where he was going, in order to not be interrupted. So little things like that, which I just found so inspiring, and he was so creative and imaginative with how he remained in control of his own life. So it was things like that I found very inspiring.
Hi, I'm Laura from Soho Picture Book. People have talked about how tear-jerking the script was and how moving it is, but I couldn't help from watching it that there's some real sense of comic relief in it as well, and some really humorous scenes that rely on a lot of quick comic timing as well. What was it like to perform those scenes in comparison to the more serious ones?
I don't think... I'd never had any quick comic timing. I think everyone else is quite funny around us. You were hilarious, Andrew. But I don't know. I mean, when you've got people like Tom Hollander, who's playing twins. You just sit back and watch, really, in awe of it. But I think that was, as much as I can gather, is exactly how Robin and Diana lived their life. They were constantly having parties and friends round, and just tried to find the funny side of a really terrible situation. But I think that's human nature, really, and that's what you try and do. If you can't laugh, then you'd cry. And we do both in this film, I think, quite a lot of both.
And Bill, maybe you can talk about, from a writing perspective, the kind of use of humour throughout this script.
Well, it's incredibly important, obviously, and it's something that was in the story. I mean, that's from Jonathan's parents. I mean, I did see this from the start, really, as the story of a marriage, rather than the story of a disability. And although the disability completely informs everything, but when you're writing about the tensions and stresses within a marriage, particularly English people, I think we deal with pain through humour. Very, very typically. So it was very important to get that in. So when Jonathan fed me and Diana, his mother, fed me all they could about what happened, I was picking up very strongly on anything that gave me an opportunity for a comic scene or comic dialogue. And of course the twins are an absolute gift. And I mean, I do think, I must emphasize what Claire said. I think Tom Hollander's performance as two separate people is unbelievably subtle and clever and funny, considering he's not there when he's performing, if you see what I mean. Quite a remarkable piece of work.
Great, next question, and then we'll come to you on the end.
Can I?
Yes.
Hi, I am Juliana from BR Press. It's a Brazilian content agency. And I'd like to ask Andrew if this is the biggest superhero you have performed ever.
Yeah.
And if you've seen footage of, we see footage by the end of the film, and if you had the opportunity to actually see this man doing all the things he did.
It's a lovely question, and yeah, there is something truly heroic about the life that Robin created with Diana and with their friends. And I think what's important to underline and highlight is that it was a community effort. It wasn't this one man and his superheroics, which is a story that we get fed a lot in our culture now. But in fact, I think there's some other story that I believe will save us from the terrible situation we're in culturally and societally, that we are all absolutely needed, that everyone has some genius to offer the world. And I think that one of the remarkable things about the script and about the story of Jonathan's life and his parents' life is that it took a village. It really did. If it wasn't for Teddy Hall's inventive brilliance and his love, if it wasn't for the devotion of Diana's brothers, if it wasn't for the devotion of Robin's friends, then life wouldn't have been so beautiful. So I find that incredibly heroic, that everyone was showing up and pouring themselves into the situation. What was the other part of the question? I saw as much footage as was on offer, and it was mostly footage from when Robin was older, when Jonathan started to interview him and ask him lots of questions, which we're all kind of grateful that there is that footage, but stacks and stacks of old beautiful photo albums, and maybe more than anything talking to people who knew him. That was and really through Jonathan, I feel Robin's presence very much through Jonathan. He is definitely his father's son in all those beautiful ways.
Hi, I'm Ed from The Mirror. I had a couple of questions for Claire. Obviously, you've had huge success with The Crown. I was just wondering if you're excited about, now that people know that your role is at some point coming to an end, of getting to do more films like this. And also, I wondered if you had like an actress that you thought that you could tip, or you would like to see take on the role of the Queen after you leave the role.
I know who's doing it.
You do?
Yeah, and I'm not telling you. So there. It's really exciting and great and amazing.
Tell us.
I'll go on then. But yeah, no, I mean, I always knew from the get-go that I was only going to be doing 2 series. So I'm just very, very grateful that I have had such a wonderful time playing that part and making friends for life, and just had the best time ever. And so I'm very, very grateful and amazed that I can go and do other stuff, hopefully. And, you know, this job came along at a time where I thought I was going to have a holiday and a rest and a break. And I didn't do that. But yeah, I'm very grateful for this one too. I'm just very grateful all the time. Yeah.
We're just going to go to the gentleman at the back and then we'll come to you.
Hi there, it's Alistair Harkness from The Scotsman. It's a question for Andy. You mentioned, over here, you mentioned that the script was slightly out of your wheelhouse, but you also appreciate the fact that there were mavericks. I wonder if the fact that it's about somebody whose life was actually made possible by technology sort of resonated with you, with what you've been doing as a filmmaker over the last 10, 15 years.
I think, I mean, I should sort of back this up by saying, because my father's a doctor and built a hospital in, I'm half Iraqi, and my father built a hospital in Baghdad, and my mother taught disabled children. So I actually witnessed technology at first hand quite early on at the school where she taught, where children with spina bifida and thalidomide and other paraplegics and polio sufferers were using possum machines and various different things. So I felt that I had, and also my sister is an MS sufferer. So really my points of connection were more about, for instance, I know how difficult it is for her to get around in 2017 in a wheelchair. I cannot understand how they physically possibly could manoeuvre around or be around, get around in 1960s and 70s. So really it was. My inspirations for this film came, and you, like the family that you were talking about, this village of people. I was brought to mind of the story of Philip Petit and Man on Wire story, and that great heist of being able to string a wire up between the Twin Towers, and this devoted bunch of followers, this cabal of sort of enablers that enabled him to do that. Really. That idea of living life 2 minutes away from death, and but sort of in a Heath Robinsonian, just sort of inventing life moment by moment, and an accumulative effect of that. You know, once your own life becoming fulfilled, enabling to others to fulfill their own. Those are the things that really fired me up. I mean, Jonathan and I have been, you know, with the company, have been trying to push the boundaries in terms of storytelling, and it's not about the technology, you realise, it's about the people.
Okay. You.
All right, thank you. It's Adriana from Betty Forum International, and I have a question to the producer. Now the movie is finished. Is there anything you would change or would do another way? Because that's the worst thing that could happen.
Recast.
It's a very rare situation, you know, when you make a film that you actually don't look back on it with any regret in any frame of it. I'm particularly grateful for these two, because it wasn't just that they got the spirit of my parents. They somehow encapsulated them, and Claire spent quite a lot of time with my mother. And they have similarities of character, perhaps, but for Andrew to recreate somebody who's been dead for 23 years was just to me and to anybody who knew my father, literally extraordinary. About 3 weeks before we started shooting, I was checking my messages, and I got a message from my father. Using all the words that he used to call me Jay, and I was completely overwhelmed and frankly confused, slow-wittedly. And at the end, the voice said, "How was that?" And of course, it was him. And it was an extraordinary thing. I have one regret, which is really a regret of my mother's. When we showed my mother a clip of the film for the first time, my mother loves the film, thank God. We showed her a sort of 5-minute clip, and I said, "Don't say anything, just watch it through." It's been quite a big thing for her. And halfway through, she'd been keeping it in as long as she can. She said, "Oh, I would never have worn that hat," which was the hat she wore in the hospital. So that is my regret, that we allowed her to wear the hat.
And how did she feel about the film, Jonathan?
Well, she absolutely loves the film. I mean, the first time she watched it, she was terrified, which I've never seen before, actually. It's the first time in my life, interestingly, that I've seen her frightened. And she said, I've decided to take the view that this film is not about me at all. So I went, okay, that's probably why. And she was sort of in shock, I think, because everything had come back in a most extraordinarily powerful way. She's seen it a couple of times since, and she does absolutely love it. It also is the first thing I've ever done that has validated my own professional life. So I'm very grateful to you all for doing that.
Yep, you.
I have one question for Andrew and Claire and one for Andy and Jonathan. My question is for Andy and Jonathan. If you can choose 3 words to describe this film and recommend it to the audience, which 3 you want to choose? And for Andrew and Claire, what is your first feeling when you hear you will cooperate with each other? Thank you.
3 words.
3 words.
Yeah, inspirational.
Joyous.
Oh dear.
Yeah. I mean, I think witty.
Witty.
How about I answer for Andrew?
Yeah.
I don't think he had any idea who I was. Still doesn't. No, we're a very similar age, but he. There we go. But he started doing this a lot longer before than I did. So I, as a young-ish person who was training to be an actor, looked at him and went, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" Yeah, no, I did. I just think he's amazing, and I always did, and never would have thought our paths would have crossed. And you know, I haven't been ruined by working with him. I now think differently of him, but I still think he's just amazing, and he's the most incredible actor.
I'm gonna say something now, because I hadn't seen Claire's work before, and I didn't know her at all, and it was really an amazing vision that Andy and Jonathan had about us working together, that I was very happy to trust, and then I found out that it was beyond remarkable, and that she's beyond remarkable, as we all know now. It was genuinely one of the most profound kind of artistic, creative, and kind of friendships that I've ever fostered and been a part of. So there.
We're going to go to the gentleman at the back, and then we're going to come to you at the front.
Hi guys, way at the back here with the cameras. Congratulations on a beautiful piece of cinema. My question is primarily to Claire and Andrew. We obviously live in a time where relationships and indeed marriages seem to be very disposable commodities. And I think I'd be really interested to hear how important you feel it is to have a story like this, celebrating a relationship that thrives and survives in circumstances that I think a lot of people would probably struggle to comprehend.
I mean, I think that Robin and Diana are very much a product of their time and their upbringing and the morals and standards of that time. I don't think that relationships in the world that we live in are anything to do with the fact that anyone becomes ill or there's a crisis in some way and people just jump ship. I think that's just to do with the change in society and the way things are, and life and views and options and all those sorts of things. But I think this circumstance and this scenario is very human, and I think that's beyond time and anything like that. I think people behave exactly the same now. People support people they love and look after them and care for them in just the same way now as they did then. But, you know, oh, God, do you want anything to add?
Well, I mean, I think we're all still longing for that kind of true love connection, whether it's for a lifetime or for as long as it's needed. I'm a little bit scared of the puritanical idea of one person for the rest of your life. If that works, that's wonderful, and if it doesn't, that's also wonderful. think some people are meant to come together to create children, and then they have the third act of their lives alone, or whatever that is. I think ascribing any one rule to marriage, one rule to partnership. I mean, the diversity of nature, I believe, is reflected in all of our uniqueness as human beings. I think there are so many ways of living a connected life of love and partnership, and I think it's each to their own, really.
Okay, so we've got one last question, which is this lady down here, down the front, on the front row. Yes.
It's coming.
He's behind you. Yeah.
Right there. You got it.
Hi, Eva from Czech Republic. I want to ask Andy Serkis. We got flyers with polio after the screening. So, are there any plans to use the film as to help to raise awareness about this problem, or in some official way, like if there's the flyers will be in a cinema or something like that?
Absolutely, and I think Jonathan's better placed to actually answer that question. Actually.
Yes, I mean, obviously we've been consulting all the various organisations who help not just polio but other neurological disabilities and things like that. And in fact, my mother and I started a charity called CS Disabled Holidays some time ago, which provides grants for severely disabled people to allow them to go on holiday. Because obviously what we don't think about so much is that disabled people need holidays more than anybody else does, and they are probably less likely to be able to go on them for lack of resources and lack of care and everything else. And because my father's huge belief was in quality of life for people like himself, that's what he fought his life for. Once he had arranged a way for himself and my mother and me to have a good life, he then turned his attention to helping everybody else. And in a very small way, that's what we're trying to do with this charity. But we're also involved with the polio eradication regime, the polio fellowship, all sorts of other organisations who hopefully will profit from the general awareness of severe disability that this film throws up.
Okay, that's all we have time for. So a reminder that Breathe opens the 61st BFI London Film Festival tonight. It's the European premiere, and it's out in UK cinemas on the 27th of October. So join me in thanking Bill Nicholson, Andy Serkis, Andrew Garfield, Claire Foy and Jonathan Cavendish.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey You Guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yeah.
Nice.
Hey You Guys!
Obviously, you've had huge success with The Crown. I was just wondering if you're excited about, now that people know that your role is at some point coming to an end, of getting to do more films like this. And also I wondered if you had like an actress that you thought that you could tip, or you would like to see take on the role of the Queen after you leave the role.
I know who's doing it.
You do?
Yeah, and I'm not telling you. So there. It's really exciting and great and amazing.
Tell us.
I'll go on then. But yeah, no, I mean, I always knew from the get-go that I was only going to be doing 2 series. So I'm just very, very grateful that I have had such a wonderful time playing that part and making friends for life, and just had the best time ever. And so I'm very, very grateful and amazed that I can go and do other stuff, hopefully. And, you know, this job came along at a time where I thought I was going to have a holiday and a rest and a break, and I didn't do that. But yeah, I'm very grateful for this one too. I'm just very grateful all the time. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey, you guys, huh?
Hey, you guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yes.
Nice.
Hey!